Hello and welcome to the Museum of Modern Art in the city of Mexico. My name is Álvaro Santana Acuña and I'm the curator of this exhibition dedicated to Gabriel García Márquez. And this is an exhibition about the making of García Márquez as a global writer. So this exhibition uses primarily the archives of the Harry Ramson Center at the University of Texas in Austin, and it's an opportunity to see for the first time in Latin America works and other materials related to the life and works of one of the most important writers in the Spanish language of all time, and certainly one of the most popular writers in the last century. So welcome and please come in. Okay, we're now in section 1 of the exhibition dedicated to the childhood of García Márquez, and the goal in this section is to really show you how García Márquez became a professional writer. Right? So what's really the literary imagination that living in Colombia, how it helped him to become a professional writer. So we start with his family, especially his grandparents, also the genealogical tree of his family, the house where he actually lived with his grandparents, and it's one of the fictional characters, so to speak, in the novel 100 Years of Solitude, a video in which he talks about his childhood in Aracataca, and then also some of the first manuscripts and published texts in which García Márquez wrote about what eventually became 100 Years of Solitude. Another important document in the exhibition is actually this tiny manuscript written by the very famous Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges, who at the same time García Márquez was actually writing the early drafts of what eventually became 100 Years of Solitude. He was also writing, although they didn't know each other, he was actually working on a similar story, which he never published. So some of the books that García Márquez also read and that influenced him, and then also putting García Márquez in context. So we see García Márquez where he was born, where you see the yellow butterfly. That's actually the banana region in Aracataca, which was one of the most important banana regions in the world. And as a result of that, it was also an area where there were very powerful commercial interests. So we see, for instance, the chronicle of the army, the colonel who was actually responsible for the massacre of many several banana workers, and that political event is central to the political imaginary of the young García Márquez. It eventually became a chapter, an episode in the novel, and also it was certainly something that politicians at the time did not forget. So Jorge Eliezer Gaitán, for instance, denounced the massacre in the national media. And in the last wall, we just basically get a sense of García Márquez's early creative passions, drawing, poetry, and music. And then also a very interesting discovery in the archive was actually this text written by his eventual wife, Mercedes Barcha, who was actually the first person in the family who won a literary award. It was not García Márquez, it was actually Mercedes Barcha at the age of 15, who was the writer of this award-winning text on the Magdalena River in Colombia. So we're now in section 2 of the exhibition. This section covers the early adulthood of García Márquez when he decided to become a professional writer. So we see the reproduction of his first published short story, followed by the very sad and tragic events of the so-called Bogotazo, riots that spread throughout the country, and García Márquez decided to move back to the coast where it was safer for him, and then where he started writing op-eds and columns in local newspapers. He also became friends with very important intellectuals or artists at the time in Barranquilla. They helped him to write new short stories using techniques from important writers at the time, such as Hemingway or Faulkner or Virginia Woolf, and we see examples of that. At the same time, García Márquez was trying to learn from journalism how to write better. He was also trying to learn from cinema, and one of the things that García Márquez did was actually he became a film critic. And for a year and a half, he was actually writing very insightful film reviews for national newspapers. And not only cinema and journalism, but also literature itself became another important training, another important school for Garcia Marquez. Here actually is a selection of manuscripts from a work that was very influential in his early years, As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, or also Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf, the edition that Garcia Marquez read of Ulysses, and also the important and influential work, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. So here, in this case, then we see how all these things, journalism, literature, and cinema are coming together. The first major literary success of Garcia Marquez was actually a journalistic reportage on a very sad event that unveiled a corruption scheme in the Colombian army. The first time that we actually see a word that's going to change world literature, Macondo, his first professional contract, a very bad professional contract, as was actually typical for many Latin American writers at the time. And since he actually, with this reportage, exposed a major fraud in the army, he had to leave the country, move to Paris, where he decided to become a full-time writer because the newspaper where he worked actually was shut down by the military government. There he met his very important friend, Plinio Puleyo Mendoza, who got him a job in Venezuela, where he also lived with his wife, Mercedes, working primarily as a freelance writer. And we see a selection of reportages that he wrote at the time, until in 1959, he decided to work for the Cuban Revolution, for the news agency called Prensa Latina, and 2 years later he moved to the United States, where he actually worked for 6 months until, fearing political retaliation, decided to move to a country that changed his life, Mexico. So we're now in section 3, which is dedicated exclusively to Garcia Marquez's stay in Mexico City, where he was really trying to become not a writer, not really a journalist. He wanted to be a script writer. So cinema at the time in Mexico was booming, and here we see pieces that actually talk about how Garcia Marquez wanted to get into cinema, and also how he actually experienced the mixture of fantasy and reality in Mexico. He writes about that in this letter. We can see that also in the work of writers at the time, or photographers such as Álvarez Bravo, in which objects seem to come to life, even though some of them are actually kind of dead objects. So Garcia Marquez, as I said, wanted to get into cinema, but he was actually a migrant without papers. So the best job that he could eventually get was working for tabloid magazines such as La Familia and Sucesos. Nonetheless, the owner of these magazines eventually offered him the opportunity to be a scriptwriter, and he was certainly very happy about that. He started working on what eventually became his first major success in cinema, Time to Die, Tiempo de Morir. And you can see here the final script and also the scene on the wall. So Garcia Marquez was actually even thinking about going to Hollywood. There's a letter that talks about that project, but the producer actually got bankrupt and didn't have enough money. So Garcia Marquez had actually to work in advertising, while he was also trying to make a living as a writer if he could. So one of the things that he tried to do was to get his first major work, No One Rises to the Colonel, published, and it was a very difficult publication, but eventually he got it published again in Mexico City, second edition, and also the first edition in French. And that also happened because at the time, Garcia Marquez was at the center of a very important cultural movement, the so-called Latin American boom. And we can see an example of all the novels that really paved the way for Garcia Marquez to become a very successful writer with the publication of 100 Years of Solitude. And that happened also because Garcia Marquez was at the center of a very important group of intellectuals and writers working in Mexico City under the leadership of Carlos Fuentes. And this group provided Garcia Marquez with the support necessary to write that novel that he had been trying to write for 50 years, 100 Years of Solitude. Okay, welcome now to section 4, which we dedicate to the making of Garcia Marquez's master work, 100 Years of Solitude. We start with the house where he actually wrote it in Mexico City, a letter from the acquisitions editor asking him what he was actually writing. Also a letter with a friend in which he tells him that I'm already working on a novel, I'm very happy about it. We can see Garcia Marquez in action at the time writing in his studio. And then in this section, there is actually a little reportage with the testimonies of people who helped him to write that novel. That includes especially the poet and actor Maria Luisa Elio, who would actually come to see him almost every day. And to her and her husband, Garcia Marquez dedicated the first edition of 100 Years of Solitude. Different letters that tell us about the story of the making of the novel. And then we get to what we can call like the altar piece of the exhibition, which are the different manuscripts or typescripts of 100 Years of Solitude. And the selection of pages includes, of course, the opening of the novel, which if you were here in this gallery, you could also listen to Garcia Marquez listening the first chapter of the novel to you. Different versions of the typescript and different people that help him to write the novel. And then we get to the final stages, the contract, the galleys, and then the first book review written by his friend Carlos Fuentes, which Fuentes wrote when Garcia Marquez has actually not yet finished the novel. The publication, the first edition, with this kind of improvised cover that was eventually replaced in the second edition by the cover design by Vicente Rojo, the very famous Mexican design and visual artist. And then at the time, thanks to the boom of Latin American literature, Garcia Marquez was actually able, on the cover of magazines such as Primera Plana, which presented 100 Years of Solitude as the great novel of America. Audiobooks, of course, are not a product of our times only. So Garcia Marquez, when he went to Argentina to promote the novel, also recorded the first chapter of the novel. And then advertising, right? So you can see that the launch of the book was relatively modest. So you can see 100 Years of Solitude along with other books. But the novel sold out its first edition, and then the publisher realized that something was going on. So the publisher asked some of the important contemporary writers at the time to write blurbs on 100 Years of Solitude. And with all that support, the novel rose to the #1 of bestsellers at the time, and it was there for almost a year. And by then, within the first year, 100 Years of Solitude had sold over 100,000 copies, which at the time was a real record. And that, the publication of this novel, cut the life of Garcia Marquez into two parts. So as I was telling you in the previous section, the publication of 100 Years of Solitude cut the life of Garcia Marquez into two parts. And because of that, we break the chronological line in the exhibition, and then we have like three transversal sections now in which we talk about the first one, Garcia Marquez as a successful writer, Garcia Marquez as an activist, political in terms of politics and culture, and in the last one, Garcia Marquez transformed into a global icon. So in this section dedicated to the successful writer, we see the writers that he was using. He was not afraid of embracing new technologies, on the contrary. So Garcia Marquez wrote in Barcelona, Autumn of the Patriarch, and we can see the different techniques that he was using. Also, the people that he received help from, that eventually also contribute to his success, Carmen Balcells. And a very interesting item here, which is the rejection letter from the New Yorker magazine, which rejected Garcia Marquez's short story, The Trail of Your Blood on the Snow, claiming that the end of the short story was not good. And what's interesting is that actually a few months later, Garcia Marquez won the Nobel Prize in Literature. Other manuscripts that give us a never-seen detailed approach to his creative process, the manuscript of Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where we can see that even at the very last moment, Garcia Marquez changed the last name of the main character, or also a selection of pages from the manuscript of Love in the Time of Cholera, in which we can see that he's using also different techniques and even making corrections in the first edition that he added in silence or silently in the second edition. And Garcia Marquez was really a writer obsessed with powerful writing, even in the very stages of his life. So we can see here the manuscript of typescript of his last published novel, Memories of Melancholy Horse, in which we can see that when he got to version number 7, he actually crossed it out and started all over again. And still there are actually 11 versions left for the book to be completed. So when we talk about genius, I think it's important to show all the hard work that is behind the making of a work like this, but also other works such as News of a Napkin, so we can see the notebook that he used to take notes, or the making of the general in his labyrinth, right? The very, very detailed process of reconstructing the life of Bolivar in the last 6 months of his existence. Or also the manuscripts, very early manuscripts of Living to Tell the Tale, first volume, also the second volume, and then the last novel, which remain unfinished. We will see each other in August. And then a selection of photographs showing how the famous writer reconciled being a full-time successful writer with social and family life. Okay, so we're now in section 6, another transversal section dedicated to Garcia Marquez, converted into an activist, political and cultural. So here's a section on the political activism of Garcia Marquez. So a statement he wrote after the assassination of Mexico's presidential candidate Colosio, photographs with the current president of Mexico, the Subcomandante Marcos of the Chiapas region Zapatista movement, letters from other important mandataries of Latin America, former US President Bill Clinton, Gorbachev, leader of the Soviet Union, or the president of the French Republic, François Mitterrand, and of course, a special place for that special relationship of Garcia Marquez with Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution, a relationship that was praised but also criticized as well. We are living in an age of pandemic, and it is important to recall that Garcia Marquez also made a film called The Year of the Plague, which was actually part of his efforts also to create a Latin American cinema, a letter that he wrote to the heads of state asking for their support for Latin American cinema, a movie based on one of the film scripts that we see here that was actually a TV series, the creation of his journalism foundation, now called Gabo Foundation, that promotes the legacy of the writer, and then also a selection of important letters with famous and successful creators such as Shakira, a correspondence with Marlon Brando, who wanted to adapt one of his novels, also with Francis Ford Coppola, who wanted to adapt another of his novels, Ruben Blades, or the Japanese novel laureate Kensaburo Oe. And I want to attract your attention to this last item, which is Garcia Marquez making a statement for Time magazine on what he thought was one of the most important problems of the 21st century. And Garcia Marquez said that the most important problem that humanity faces is actually the destruction of the environment. And if we don't solve that problem, humanity would eventually disappear. And finally, we got to the section number 7 that is dedicated to Garcia Marquez transformed into a global literary icon, a global symbol. Part of that transformation has to do with the reception of the Nobel Prize in Literature. Here's actually the telegram that many writers have dreamt to receive, the telegram from the Swedish Academy, confirming or telling Garcia Marquez that he has won the Nobel Prize, the celebration with his family, the ceremony. And after getting the Nobel Prize, Garcia Marquez received hundreds of telegrams, and we have a selection of those telegrams from people such as Graham Greene, Umberto Eco, Julio Cortázar, and of course Mexican writers. Garcia Marquez then becomes a very celebrated, very demanded professional, and we see a selection of letters that are giving him an award, a recognition, and a letter that Garcia Marquez wrote as a kind of model letter that he used to reject many of these recognitions so he would be able to concentrate and write. From the National Gallery, from the United Nations, a Harvard professor or an ordinary reader, sharing with him also the experience of reading his books. Letters from parents who actually named their children after Gabriel, or a letter from a small, little girl in Ukraine who in 2009 told him that he was a genius and sent him this bouquet of flowers. And then when we get here, we already starting to see that Garcia Marquez was made by a world, as we saw in the first section, but now we see also the world that the work of Garcia Marquez is contributing to create. His influence on literature, influence in cinema, his face on bills, bookmarks, stamps, right? And then also souvenirs and important documents from his trip to Sweden to get the Nobel Prize, his boarding pass, the manuscript of his Nobel lecture, and then we close the exhibition with this selection of photographs of Garcia Marquez, aging, his portrait, photos with the homage he received in 2007, and then also the coverage of the sad news of his passing in Mexico City in 2014. And at the time, Garcia Marquez received the love of many when he passed away in Mexico City. So by then he was certainly transformed into a global writer, and this is the image that we want to leave you when you exit the exhibition, right? Garcia Marquez, 2 years before his passing, surrounded by a selection of remarkable, beautiful, strange reproductions of covers of his works in more than 50 countries and in more than 30 languages, which again remind us of why Garcia Marquez became a global writer. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoyed the exhibition.
Gobierno de México.